Hello. Hello, everyone. Um, Hello, I hope you can all hear me. My name is Nina. I am part of the One Day team, which is one of the small startups of the student organization and young social business prime movers. And we are very happy to welcome you to our third meetup this year. It's the first time as an online webinar. And today's topic will be the post-truth world and social media, where good intentions are not good enough. While we have to deal with fake news and controversial opinions that challenge our beliefs all the time in our daily lives, and especially the past weeks in the crisis had made that even more obvious. And therefore, we will be trying to find answers to questions like, what are cognitive biases? How can we recognize and escape those biases and filter bubbles we're all caught in? Also, what is post-truth? What and whom can we trust in this post-truth era? How do we form our opinions, and what role do social media and digitalization play in here? These are all questions discussed tonight. But why are we doing this? First, to learn and find an answer to these questions, obviously. But secondly, we're all here for another reason. The panel discussion tonight will give us input and help in trying to understand the complex systems behind the wide field of social media, fake news, and a post-truth world. And all we learned today, all the ideas we create and potential challenges we see in the issues are kept and taken to One Day conference, which we organize every year. At the conference, we're bringing over 200 people from different backgrounds together to address global challenges of our society. Academics, NGOs, companies, young professionals, students, just passionate people like everyone here tonight are getting together to participate in various workshops and panel discussions and sessions about systems thinking and social innovation. It's a space to exchange, to gain knowledge and learn different perspectives. This year's conference has already taken place on the 9th of March, but we've already started with the organization and planning of next year's conference in March 2021. What's different compared to today's event is that at the conference we're not only learning and talking about the given issue, but we're actually trying to come up with ideas to create solutions for social and environmental problems. The main topics that will be discussed are gender equality, digitalization, and waste and food waste. And for creating the solutions, we follow a simple 3-step process. First, beforehand, we start with deep research on our topics. We're holding interviews with experts, and we're working together with organizations and NGOs to create these challenges that will be worked on at One Day conference next year. Also, having meetups like today are part of this research. Step number 2 is the One Day lab session at the conference itself, where we actively create ideas with the experts on the issues and change makers like you. Step by step, participants will be developing the ideas together for social businesses, apps, websites, or workshops for children ready to be implemented. And the final and last step is the full implementation of these ideas. We will pass all the ideas from the sessions of the conference onto the existing social entrepreneurship network. Yes, and as I mentioned before, One Day is part of the young social business and student organization Prime Movers, which offers a leadership program for students. And besides One Day, there are 2 more young startups at Prime Movers, which were actually developed as an output of past conferences from One Day. So The first startup at Prime Movers we have is Kindby. It's an online store where you can rent sustainable baby clothing and accessories. And you can check out the website to get more information. And the second one we also have at Prime Movers is Mission Liftoff, which is an online platform where teachers can download lesson plans about sustainability, gender equality, and digitalization. And you can also find the link on the website here as well. And yeah, for now, lean back, make yourself comfortable, and become part of this discussion tonight. It would be great if we could take all our learnings from tonight with us to be used in the following one-day events. And we're always happy to talk to you later on. You can contact us at any time. If you have questions during the talk, feel free to type in the comments in the comment section here. And finally, before I pass on the word to Okan McAllister, who is the founder of One Day and Prime Movers, and will be continuing with the moderation of the rest of the talk, I would like to wish you all an inspiring webinar with a lot of new learnings and new perspectives. And yeah, lean back and enjoy. Thank you. How can I change?
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for that presentation, Nina. My name is Okan. I am from the One Day team. I would like to also give you a warm welcome from my side to One Day to Meetup about post-truth and social media. So I'm going to give you a little bit about how this is going to work. So we are live on Facebook right now. So we will take questions at the end of the talk. The way that will work is if you just simply comment under the live stream on Facebook, like Felix has done here, we can bring them to the stream and answer them. This won't be the scope of today's discussion, but this is how the question and answers will work. If you share about this meetup online, if you have thoughts about it, you can always tag us on primemovers.org on Instagram and Facebook. Okay, let's get started. I will present you now our speakers. The first one is Ming Boyer. He's a pre-doctoral researcher at the Department of Communication of the University of Vienna. His research interests include intergroup processes surrounding news consumption and their consequences for democracy and society. In his PhD project, Ming Boyer studies the way that membership in social groups influence how we consume, process, and interpret news, as well as how news consumption affects such group memberships in terms of in-group identification, out-group attitudes, worldviews, and policy attitudes. In other words, how does the way we identify influence how we form our political opinions, and how do our surroundings influence the way we identify? Ming, welcome to the stream. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Okan. I'm glad to be here.
Our next speaker is Steve Fuller. He is an August Comte Professor of Social Epistemology at the University of Warwick, UK, trained in history, philosophy, and sociology of science. He is the author of 25 books, including Post-Truth, Knowledge as a Power Game. He will be publishing a follow-up book on post-truth actually in the autumn with Anthem Press, and it'll be called The Player's Guide to the Post-Truth Condition, the name of the game. Steve, please welcome to the stream, and thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to talking about this topic today. One small disclaimer I do want to mention is this is a first for us. Unfortunately, we have an all-male panel. I would like to take responsibility for this. As the One Day team, we have not, I think, adapted to the challenges of COVID-19 that presented us when we're organizing this conference. This is not really how we do things usually. So just a little disclaimer on that. My apologies. So let's start with the basics. In 2016, the Oxford Dictionary selected post-truth as the international word of the year. In the same year, the word postfaktisch was also chosen the word of the year by the German Language Society. And I think a lot of people equate post-truth with fake news, for example. Steve, could you please clarify to us what is post-truth and what is the difference between post-truth and fake news?
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great way to begin. And I should say post-truth is a very contested term. And I think the best way you can see that is by looking at what the Oxford English Dictionary says post-truth is, because it presupposes that there are certain kinds of arguments that are, as it were, motivated and driven primarily by evidence and reason on the one hand. And on the other hand, there's this other form of argument that's being driven by bias and emotion, right? I mean, basically, the definition of post-truth in the Oxford English Dictionary presupposes that sort of dichotomy. Now, to my mind, that's a certain kind of post-truth definition of post-truth because it's biased in a certain kind of way. It's spun, right? And it presupposes that one has a very clear sense of which is which, right? And from my standpoint, and this is where I'm different from the Oxford English Dictionary, I think the post-truth condition, and I think it is a condition that we're not going to get away from very soon, is a much more fundamental thing. That really we're not talking about what is true and false and how to distinguish between the two, which is usually the fake news business, but rather who actually sets the terms by which we decide what is true or false, right? This is why this follow-up book of mine is called The Name of the Game, right? Because there's a sense in which you have to kind of know what the rules of the game are by which we decide what is true and false. And so one of the things that's going on now with the phenomenon being called fake news is that you're basically getting alternative sources of authority being created, right? Being created online, being created, through the internet, right? And so as a result, the whole idea that there is some kind of unified way of distinguishing between true and false, and if we just have the evidence, we'll know what's right, that is the thing that's being questioned now in the post-truth condition, right? In a sense, this idea that there's a kind of knowledge authority out there that we can ultimately appeal to that's unified, that is the thing that is falling apart now. And I don't think that's going to be put back together again in any kind of straightforward fashion. In other words, this idea about what the difference between true and false is for the time being, and I think for the foreseeable future, a contested space.
So you are, of course, coming from a different perspective here. You're, among other things, trained in philosophy. And there are a lot of arguments that post-truth is some rehashing of ancient philosophy. And if we go way back to Plato's Republic, can you tell us what philosopher kings is and why is this relevant to the post-truth and access to information currently?
Well, I mean, the point is, this is the interesting thing about the history of philosophy. The reason why Plato, in a sense, had to start it was because he was faced with a world, you might say the default position is actually post-truth. In other words, there's lots of contested authorities, and this is especially true if you've got a democratic society. And remember, the thing that was really bothering Plato that led him to want to create this idea of the philosopher king, the person who has this kind of ideal combination of knowledge and power, right? His judgment is very well respected because, in fact, he knows the truth in some sense, knows it better than anyone else. The need for that kind of a figure was as a result of the instability that was being created in Athens, right, among the citizens, right, who were, in the kind of limited sense in which they had a democracy, of course, but nevertheless, within that context, there was an enormous amount of contestation, which led to an enormous kind of volatile shifts in opinion all the time, which led Athens in getting into all kinds of crazy wars and conflicts and things like this, which eventually, of course, undermined the entire society. This is what Thucydides talks about in the Peloponnesian War, basically, which is happening at the time Plato's growing up, basically. And in a sense, Plato's figurehead, Socrates, is somehow trying to deal with this contested space and trying to bring some order to it. And Plato's idea was basically that unless you have a unified standard, some kind of uniform standard by which we can judge true or false, right, we will just constantly be in this, game of people trying to persuade each other one way or another. And as a result, the society will just fall apart, right? And this is the thing that, in a sense, Plato was directly trying to address, was the seemingly inevitable cycle of societies forming, maturing, and disintegrating because there isn't a common source of what philosophers would call epistemic authority, namely, who can you trust for knowledge? And that was what the philosopher king was meant to establish. And the way Plato sets it out is basically a kind of form of education that would-be rulers would need to have. And it's primarily education in the more abstract sciences and arts, right? And you're educated for a very long time, and as a result, you're sort of removed from the passions and the biases and so forth, which in a sense are okay in the population as long as they have limited reach, right? So Plato was very keen, that obviously different people know different things, right? Largely at an empirical or practical level, and that was very important for society to function. But it doesn't follow that those people necessarily ought to be saying how the entire society ought to be run, right? That's a different matter. And that's where you need the people who have the intellectual superiority. And the point is, Plato believes that you can sort of establish a society where that kind of respect to epistemic authority is given, right? So in a sense, it's the ultimate soft power, you might say, right? If people recognize that I know more than they do, right, they will listen to what I say without my having to threaten them. They will respect knowledge for what it is, right? This was kind of Plato's idea. So in a way, this is how knowledge and power would, form a kind of perfect unity, you might say, of not only, reason triumphing, but doing so in a very peaceful kind of manner, where people will realize, yes, this guy knows more than me. I should be following him, right? That was kind of Plato's idea. Right. And that was, and in a way, philosophy is always kind of stuck to that. Right. And that's why philosophy is always concerned about the foundations of knowledge. Right. Justified true belief, as it's sometimes put. Right. Who do you trust when it comes to various kinds of things? Philosophy keeps on returning all the time, as it were, to this kind of Platonic premise that grounds the whole thing. And I think the people who are very disturbed about post-truth these days, right, namely the people who are naming it, are the people who still have this kind of residual, Platonism in them.
I will zoom into that, and we're gonna talk about some pieces of that throughout the talk. So that was, I think, a great introduction to a lot of things we're gonna talk about today. Let's talk about facts. This fact versus fiction thing. Continuing with Plato now. Why did Plato dislike playwrights, and why is this relevant to our talk today?
Well, okay. I think the key thing here is that Plato basically believed that the problem with playwrights basically is that they provide alternative realities that are too realistic, right? And so as a result, it ends up opening up people to think in different spaces than they would have otherwise. And I think you have to also realize these dramas were being performed as part of civic rituals in Athens. So in a sense, from a sociological standpoint, it wasn't exactly so clear, right, what was the real and not so real. They were, these things were happening kind of in the same space, more or less, right? And the problem, of course, was that these playwrights were good, all right? So in other words, people were dramatizing all kinds of emotions, all kinds of thoughts that were very radical in themselves, and people, listening to them say, yeah, why not? I mean, and if you think about the role of playwrights throughout history, right, they've often been the form of the arts that has been in the vanguard of revolutionary change, right? Because on stage, you start dramatizing all these alternative worlds you could be living in. People are able to voice all kinds of things that would otherwise be censored in ordinary life. So the whole space of possibility is opened up for how things could be in the world in a very strong way. And this is what Plato was worried about. So Plato wasn't against, you might say, drama per se, but he wanted it under state control, right? So in other words, so in other words, once we do have some sense of what the truth is, and the kind of vision of the world that everybody ought to be partaking in, then as it were, we have the art for that. And we're familiar with that kind of scenario, of course, from authoritarian, totalitarian regimes and so forth. And that was the sense in which Plato was an endorser of censorship, right? That in some sense, right, these arts need to be authorized. And if they're authorized, then they are factual arts, right? And we often call that propaganda, right? But the point is, that kind of art is fine, right? That is the art of fact, right? Propaganda, right? What isn't the art of fact is all this alternative stuff that just confuses people, right? And in fact, one of you may know one of Plato's students was Aristotle, who wrote very famously about drama and so forth. And the key thing that Aristotle, that was very influential for many centuries about drama. This is Aristotle reflecting on Plato in a way. This idea of catharsis, right? That every play has to end in a kind of closure of the emotions, right? You've got to purge all of those bad emotions that if you don't purge them, people are just going to carry them outside the theater and they're going to start trouble, right? So the point is you need the play to have a kind of closure to show this is just fiction, guys, right? We have a happy ending and then we go home. Right. And in a sense, this was Aristotle's way of saying, OK, you can have drama, but you've got to construct the drama in a certain way so that you mark your own fictionality in it. Right. And so it doesn't blur into the outside world. Now, you see, this is the thing. Right. This is where, because the problem with fiction is that fiction doesn't mark itself naturally. In other words, if things are dramatized very well, things are performed very well, and I think we experience this very much with the online world, right? It is, in fact, very difficult to tell the difference, right? And so it needs to be authorized. And I think one of the things that's falling apart now in the so-called post-truth condition is this kind of authorization, right? Multiple sources of news, multiple sources of information, everything is very vivid, everything's very persuasive, right? And as a result, people are kind of left adrift, as it were, in terms of how do you sort out these possibilities. So you no longer are able to make such neat fact-fiction distinctions.
I liked your choice of words at the end there with performing this.
Yeah.
Performing it very well. And I think one of the reasons why this term got popularized in the recent years is that we saw many examples of this that had really huge outcomes. And I want to talk a bit about why the action of blurring that line between fact and fiction works to a certain extent. So Ming, let's start with your area of expertise here. Start from the basic again. Could you please explain to us what a cognitive bias is, and maybe give us an example of a prominent cognitive bias that we have?
Yeah, sure. So in later democratic theories, philosophers and democratic theorists often assume that people are rational actors who make up their rational mind and then choose their rational choices in the democratic process. But we also know that people are not rational at all. And cognitive biases are these processes that happen in people's minds that systematically deviate from a certain norm or from a certain idea of rationality. So it is important that we have to note here that a bias is always compared to this norm or standard for rationality. If we don't know what is rational, we can't know what deviates from it. So, for example, in communication science, there's a lot of attention to the so-called negativity bias. So if you want to have an accurate picture of what the world looks like, you should pay equal attention to news and information regardless of how positive or negative it is. This is our rational baseline. However, we know that people pay much more attention to negative news than to positive news. And because of this bias, this deviation from our norm of rationality, people who consume more news often have a more negative view of the world than people who consume less news. And this is a problem, right? If you only read about terrorist attacks in Iraq or something, you might think that this is all that happens there. While in truth, there's a lot of rebuilding going on there as well.
So this is now a question to both of you, but let's start with Ming's answer here. Why are cognitive biases relevant at all when we talk about the post-truth condition?
Well, I think per definition, a cognitive bias makes it possible to deviate from rational thoughts and behavior. So even though if we are fully motivated to think about something in a rational way, we might come to a certain conclusion. These biases lead us in a different direction, which lead us to have a picture in our minds that's not as close to reality as it might be if we were to think about it in a more rational manner.
So when we talk about fact versus fiction earlier, would you say it's fair to say that cognitive bias is one factor that really makes it worse in terms of blurring the lines between fact and fiction?
I think they allow you to keep pictures in your mind of which you could have known that they're not true. Whether it blurs the line between fact and fiction, I'm not entirely sure, because sometimes you also cannot know the truth, right? Also, rational behavior leads to false beliefs and so on. So I don't know whether it adds to this blur, but it can explain why people don't act in a way that you would expect based on rationality.
Steve, would you like to add to this as well?
Okay, so I come at this from a somewhat different angle. As it turns out, my undergraduate minor degree was in psychology, and when I was in graduate school doing my PhD in history and philosophy of science, the teaching I did was history and systems of psychology for psychology students. And one of the things that's very interesting about the history of this topic, because in a sense, I think if you focus too much on the kind of research being done now, which is primarily about how ordinary people, have cognitive biases, one would never have known that, in fact, this research began in the 19th century because of the biases in experts. Okay, and in particular, and this is where we start to think about what exactly is the fact-fiction issue here, because Ming rightly mentioned that, in a sense, all of this discussion of bias in the history of psychology has always revolved around the notion that there is a norm that, as it were, one deviates from, right? That's a really important notion in order for the idea of bias to get off the ground, you might say, as a research topic. You have to have a notion of norm. So how does this norm get established, right? We've been referring to it all the time, and it's really crucial for the people who believe in truth and rationality and all that. But how exactly is this norm established? Because you can't really start talking about bias unless you've got the norm settled. And so if you go back to the 19th century, there's this phenomenon, very important phenomenon in the study of perception, which is pretty much where psychology came from, called the personal equation. The personal equation. You may have heard that phrase used in a lot of different ways. The original use of the term had to do with astronomical observation, right? So you've got these trained astronomers, right? Experts in seeing things out in the sky, right? And the thing is, you have an enormous amount of deviation just given to you with regard to where they think the stars are, right? These are trained observers, and there's an enormous amount of deviation. And so when you see, and this is one of the first areas where psychologists actually studied perception, was the fact that they began to realize, because they were trying to figure out, why is it that astronomers, even though we're talking about looking at stars they've been looking at for thousands of years, they really have a hard time, as it were, calibrating the measurements. And this is because they began to realize they're actually seeing things somewhat differently, and a lot had to do with bias coming in a lot of different forms, not just the kind of biases we think about today, like, prejudice or whatever you want to call it, but also bias having to do with your eyesight capacity, having to do with the time of the day, the lighting, right? There are all these contextual factors that bias, and all observation is biased. And so in a sense, the norm has to be some kind of, what do you call it? An aggregation, some kind of summation of all of the biases. Right. And so this is eventually what the astronomers had to figure out, how to construct a norm from all of this bias, right, among trained observers. Now, you see, if you begin the story that way of how we had the idea of cognitive bias, then you begin to realize that, as it were, the facticity of the norm has to be constructed out of all of these, what are inherently deviant, right, kind of different observations. And so you then construct the norm, and then on the basis of that, you could say how far things are deviating. You see, that's how it actually, and if you look at it's only when you get to the recent past that people get very interested in the cognitive biases of ordinary people, because ordinary people were always presumed to be kind of prejudiced and biased in some kind of ordinary sense. But what led to this whole research area until, let's say, the last 20 years was basically concerned about experts who are trained people who in fact show bias of all of the kinds that we now call cognitive bias: recency bias, frequency bias, right? Representativeness and bias, all these things that we associate from Daniel Kahneman and Tversky and all these guys from the 70s and 80s. Originally, they were about biases in experts. Okay, and so this, I think, is a really important contextualizing point with regard to how we think about cognitive bias, because it is a very deep thing, but in a way it was the concern about it originated because of expert bias, not because of ordinary people's bias.
Mm-hmm. And I hope that since then we came a long way.
Because it makes it harder to overcome, right? Yeah. It makes it harder to overcome. It isn't simply about learning the right stuff and all of that, because the people who in fact went through the proper education are the ones who originally were the ones displaying the bias.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about a section of this. Ming, in your research, you talk about affective states. You talk about motivated reasoning. Could you talk about what those are a little bit and explain to us what motivated reasoning and affective states are and how they are relevant when we talk about cognitive biases?
Yeah, of course. So motivated reasoning is a framework that tries to explain a lot of human information processing. And the central idea is that the way that you act and reason always stems from certain motivations. So the first and most important motivation that most people have is that they want to know that what they believe is actually true, right? So this kind of motivation is thought to stimulate broad information seeking, and is thought to be connected to being open to new arguments or thoughts that you would initially not be willing to agree with. So this motivation is thought to limit bias. But people also have different tendencies, so which lead them towards more predetermined conclusions. So we call those directional motivations. And one of the most important ones is the motivation to hold consistent beliefs, or in other words, not to have been wrong in the first place. And this leads to three main biases, and these count for more than one motivation. The first is a confirmation bias, which happens before you actually consume information, and this means that you actively seek out information with which you already agree, and you avoid information that you don't agree with. And we all do this, right? You can think about it. If you're left wing, how often do you read the Kronenzeitung? If you're right wing, how often do you read Walter? So we all do this. And then when you actually consume information, there's two more biases. The first one is called the prior attitude effect, and this means that you evaluate arguments that go against your beliefs as less strong than arguments that argue in favor of your beliefs. And if an argument is weak, then you can just leave it out, right? And the second one is a disconfirmation bias, which entails that you actively counter-argue information that you disagree with more than information that you do agree with. So consider the following. If you read a piece in an article that's written by the leader of your favorite party, you will most likely read it, think, oh, that sounds good, and take in this information in. Now consider the opposite. You read something of the party that you hate. Now, before you even become aware of it, you start thinking of arguments of why this article and the arguments in there are wrong. So people actually take longer reading information that they disagree with because they need time to think of those counter-arguments. And we think that emotional reactions cause this effect. So the part of emotion that I talk about here is the physical effect that happens before you even become consciously aware that you feel this way. And we call these affective states. We can measure these with physical reactions like tiny muscle movements in the face or sweat coming from the hand palms. And you actively avoid information that you disagree with because it makes you feel bad, even before you start reading it. And you think of counter-arguments before you even know it because the article makes you feel bad. And what these biases do is they allow you to hold on to your original beliefs, even though counter evidence was presented, right? So we often even see a backlash effect where even though counter evidence is presented, because you keep thinking of counter arguments, you even grow stronger in your original belief. Yeah, that's basically it.
So this is close to, I guess, cognitive dissonance, correct?
Yeah, this is motivated reasoning is a different framework that closely relates to cognitive dissonance. This is the cognitive dissonance explanation of motivated reasoning. There are also more, which I think we'll come to talk about later.
Yes. So what also Steve mentioned earlier is this the biases that experts, trained professionals have. Right. And I think one common narrative when we talk about things like fake news, post-truth, and all this stuff, one common narrative that we see a lot is we think if that other group of people, if they were just educated, I know my stuff, if they knew the truth, if they had all the facts about climate change, or if they had all the facts about this and that, then we would not have this problem. This is like a common narrative that people have. And there's research that strongly suggests otherwise. And we thought like this for a very long time, that when we were like, if we were educated, if we were trained, then we won't have this problem anymore. So Ming, could you please explain to us what is identity protective cognition, and why is this relevant to what we're talking about today?
Yeah. So there's basically two things I want to say about this. The first thing is not yet about identity protective cognition, but more about the replication crisis in social science. Because this is a lot of what I just said is the stuff that is the problem in the replication crisis, right? We, even as scientists, tend to ignore the findings that are not in line with our initial hypothesis, and we tend to interpret our findings in such a way that we can keep our hypothesis. And that's why a lot of stuff also gets published and it's not able to replicate them. So that's why we need to get stricter in that sense, and that's why we started pre-registering our hypothesis and our methods of analysis and such. In terms of identity protective cognition, this is a specific kind of motivated reasoning where the underlying motivation does not stem from what you already believe, but stems from your identification with a certain group. And we call this your social identity. So me as a man, I dislike reading negative news about men. That's why men get defensive in response to the Me Too movement. You know, not all men and stuff. No one said that. And as an Ajax fan, for instance, that's a football club. I really dislike reading negative news about Ajax or positive news about our rivals, Feyenoord, right? The out group, as we call that. So if you translate this to political parties or political ideologies, if I support a certain political party, I will be motivated to see this party and its political stances in a positive light. So I will think that the evidence that my party gives is always better than the evidence that the other party gives, right? And this is a very strong effect. There was this really interesting study in the US where they thought, you know, we have these conservatives here who are climate change deniers, and we have Catholics who are also often climate change deniers in the US context. But then we have this Pope who says climate change is real, right? How do they solve this in their minds? And they found that these devout Catholics who are also Republicans would sooner say that the Pope has no authority on science than to change their view on climate change. Yeah.
Okay.
And the most worrying part about this is that the more strongly you identify with these groups, the stronger these biases are, right? So the people who are most politically involved, who have the strongest social identity towards their political party, towards them being left-wing or right-wing, those are also the ones that will have these biases the most?
So we take questions at the end, but there's a very relevant question here that been asked from Jeran Shen, and she says that aren't the motivational patterns mostly ego-driven, and basically isn't the biggest bias ingrained in our DNA afraid to fall apart from a group? So I guess this is also close to what you were talking about in terms of this in-group and out-group identification, and how identifying with a certain, or having a certain social identity, identifying with a certain group actually doesn't allow us to kind of internalize this information and actually think about it.
Well, there's two ways of going here. On the one hand, we want to be part of a group, right? This is very important to humans. On the other hand, we also want to be different than the rest of this group. We don't just want to be part of this group. I don't know if being part of this group is the main driver here. What is usually thought is that people want to have a positive self-image. You want to see yourself as a good person. And if people say, men are bad because they harass women, I'm also a man, so that impacts me. And I will feel less good about myself. So that's sort of the psychological explanation that they think of as driving these effects.
I wish we had more time to talk about the implications of this in terms of communicating social and environmental problems as well, but I don't want to go too off topic here. But hopefully this inspires somebody that is watching perhaps to look into more about this as well as a separate topic. Steve, what are your thoughts about identity protective cognition?
Okay. Well, first point, I want to make two general points about this. The first one is, so all of this stuff that Ming has been talking about with regard to these motivational biases and so forth, absolutely right. They're there, right? I don't think they're necessarily fatal, however. And this is where, if you think about, for example, he was talking about earlier this kind of disconfirmation bias where, you'll spend a lot more time reading about the stuff you don't like than the stuff you do like, right? Because you want to develop the counter arguments, right, against them. Now, you see, that's actually quite useful, right? If it's put in the right social context. And I think the backdrop to think about this is in terms of something like Karl Popper's theory of conjectures and refutations in science, right? Where, I am my own best conjecture in the sense that I will put up the strongest defense for my own views, but the other guy, right? The other guy will be my strongest refuter because he will be motivated to try to disconfirm me as much as possible. And we play complementary roles to each other in that regard. So in other words, our motivational biases don't go away. They're very much there. In fact, they're part of the dynamic of the process, but what matters is the interaction, right? And that's why, and this is where, you were mentioning earlier, I'm involved in this thing called social epistemology, which is about the social foundations of knowledge. And one of the things that we just basically presuppose is like all the stuff that Ming's been talking about, namely individuals already have, as it were, these capacities and liabilities, and they're not going away. And you're not going to educate yourself out of it or anything like that. But we can socially arrange people so you can get the most out of it, as it were, right? Biases cancel each other out, and you get a kind of whole that's greater than some of the parts. And Popper's not the only one who said this in the history of philosophy. Charles Sanders Peirce and the pragmatist movement. There's a lot of people who, in a sense, realize that even scientists are motivated reasoners, right? And the issue, however, is they have to interact with each other in a very critical fashion. And this goes to the point Ming was raising with regard to the replication crisis in science and all of this kind of stuff, because one might argue that there isn't quite the right social structure going on in science, right, in order to realize this kind of picture that I'm talking about, right? So the point is that the issue about motivational bias isn't about getting rid of it, but as it were, making the best use of it, you might say. And this is where a certain kind of social engineering, right, of how we do inquiry becomes very important. And you definitely want to avoid things like filter bubbles, echo chambers, and all that kind of stuff, right? And we'll probably be going on to talk about that a little bit later. I want to make one other point, though, and this goes to the issue of the personal identity side of this, right? And the way in which this works. I think this business about group identity is definitely there. And I think it's obvious that there are certain aspects of the online world that kind of reinforce kind of the harder tendencies of it, to want to stick with the group and to draw stronger distinctions between in-group and out-group. I understand all that. But one thing that I would say that kind of cuts against that, and we should never underestimate, is if you want to, let's say, market an innovation, or if you want to put forward a new political program, one of the things that you normally need to do is, in some sense, you need to scramble the identities. You need people to kind of think away from their normal box-like way of thinking, right? You need them to kind of approach a new space. And I say this because I don't know if we're going to talk about Brexit and, well, all the stuff we're going on there. But if you look at something like Cambridge Analytica, okay, as an agent in this, and also with the Trump election as well, one of the things that those guys were very good at was kind of reconfiguring people, reconfiguring the electorate in a way. So in a sense, they were able to find certain kinds of issues that could split people apart and reorganize them to the advantage of the candidate they're trying to promote. And of course, marketing tries to do this as well if you're trying to pull people away from one kind of a product to another kind of a product, right? And in a sense, our online world, right, kind of enables this too, right? So it enables this kind of activity to take place, where in a sense you try to split apart group identities in order to reorganize people for strategic advantage. So I don't think that should not be neglected as part of the story too. So it's not all just about echo chambers and filter bubbles.
We'll talk about the social media aspect of this in a second. I would, before we zoom into that, I'd like to take one step back and talk about this response that you have to information as well. And let's start from there, and then let's talk about how social media could make this better, worse, and how this could work here. So what I like to do actually is just let me recap here by painting a picture of how the process of consuming information could look like. Okay, so let me share my screen real quick. Here, a quick kind of like. So we talked about there are different like stages, and please feel free to disagree with me, and let's build this together, and we can make this public available after the meetup as well. We talked about seeking or receiving information online, and things like fake news, echo chambers, filter bubbles, confirmation bias. These things are things to kind of like look for, watch out for at this stage of this process. And then we have seeing the actual information, and then we have a feeling that is created as a response. And this goes through, among other things, your social identity, and then it gets a little bit complicated here. Motivated reasoning, affective states. You can tell me which comes first, for example, here. And then there's a lot of stuff happening here from a sociological and psychological point of view in this red line. And then we have our response to the information in whatever way we respond to it. Does this seem accurate to you? Would you like to make additions to this?
Well, it's kind of difficult because motivated reasoning is not only caused by social identification. Mm-hmm. That's one point. Affective states precede motivated reasoning because they're mm-hmm. usually the cause of. Mm-hmm. And identity defensive cognition is a type of motivated reasoning.
Great. So affective states come first, and then motivated reasoning?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
In this
affective
case?
states always come first because they're before any conscious awareness. They happen like mm-hmm. within 200 milliseconds or something.
Wow, okay. So is it before social identity as well? Oh, actually, is it probably one variable that you feel that way in the first place is your social identity? So social identity comes first? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you have this kind of unconscious almost reaction, a physical reaction. I think affective states, correct me if I'm wrong, is the physical response to an emotional reaction.
It is, yeah.
And then motivated reasoning, among other things, and then you have something that affects your level of cognition, in this case, something to protect your identity. And in this chart I'm assuming, can be drawn many ways according to which bias you're talking about. Yes. But I wanted to just recap and break it down kind of what is happening exactly step by step when we seek information, when we see information, and how we respond to that information that we see, and in between what is happening. And this might be literally 2 seconds, but in between there's a lot of things happening. And something like this could perhaps explain a lot of the questions we have about, why would people not believe in this? Or how could somebody deny climate change? How could somebody believe this? And this is one maybe explanation of how something like this could happen. And then when you are in this response stage, something like this exists, right, Ming? Do you want to explain to us what this means?
Oh, this is a picture of a certain model that exists of affective states. So the valence axis denotes whether you feel positively or negatively about something, and the arousal axis denotes whether this is a high arousal or a low arousal emotion. So high arousal emotions would be things like anger or anxiety or enthusiasm, while low arousal emotions would be things like depression, sadness, or on the positive side, it would be things like relaxation, satisfaction. And all of these things cause different types of cognitive reactions.
Well, this is a pretty, I chose this tool because it's a very quite simple tool to kind of explain our response in an affective state, right? So this comes after you've gone through this, and this could be a part of your response, correct?
Yes, I mean this is this is something that I wrote, but obviously it still has to go through the scrutiny of the scientific system.
That's fair. I think in this talk especially we have to mention that. Mm-hmm. Okay, coming back to our general talk here, right? So we have the conditions under which we agree on fact versus fiction, truth, not truth. We have different incentives from groups that make them want to blur the lines between fact versus fiction by using different tactics. And then our brains alongside us have a lot of, let's call them loopholes for now, that result in us getting and understanding biased information that leads us to inaccurate at times and unreasonable at times conclusions. This sounds quite depressing. When I talk about my reaction to this information, it sounds quite bleak when I put it this way. And on that note, we also live in this era of hyper information, and which is of course amplified by the introduction and use of social media, a tool that enables us to communicate and get and consume information in a very fast-paced manner, and also allows us to create silos according to our interests or identity as well. So, Ming, I want to ask you: did the change, in your opinion, the change in our consumption from, let's say, printed to digital news, affect the way we absorb information? So in your opinion, does social media help, or does it inhibit our ability to develop our own worldview? So to go even further, does it, in your opinion, shrink or broaden our worldview? This is a very big question, but let's talk about it a little bit. On that note also, I will also make this question available as a poll as well. So please feel free to also tell us what you think.
Right. So I think first of all, something that I need to make clear here is that these biases are not bad things per se. What you also would not like to have is a citizenry that can be super easily persuaded and follow someone nasty. You know, it's okay that people are not persuaded that easily. it's not a bad thing per se. Then in terms of the switch to online news consumption, I think there's two narratives here. On the one hand, there's this fear of these filter bubbles where we all create our own reality on social media. And there's mixed evidence of this. There's also evidence that people actually interact with the opposite side, especially if they're very strongly involved with politics or even activists. Obviously, because we have no idea how these algorithms work, this is a potential huge danger. On the other hand, we also know that filter bubbles already existed. In the Netherlands, where I come from, in the 50s and the 60s, people would go to Catholic schools, read Catholic newspapers, watch Catholic television, live in Catholic neighborhoods, right? This already existed. And even after that, people read only one newspaper usually, and it's usually a newspaper that presents stuff that they already agree with. And if you now look at the switch to social media, you have a very diverse friend group. There's not only people who share your political beliefs, there's also your family, people from your ground school, and so on. And if they share something, you would maybe even get into contact with news or information that you would otherwise never seek out. Plus, this information comes from a source that you know and maybe trust more than just a random newspaper article. So there's also this other way of looking at it where people actually get exposed to more different things than they used to. There's not really science hasn't really resolved this issue yet. So I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah, it's quite a big question. We have, yes, and when you talk about echo chambers, we've always kind of, from a sociological point of view, always kind of tended to kind of group together with people who we agree with or people we have something in common with. And on the other hand, there's this argumentation, which there are scientific research on both sides of this coin, that social media platforms make it very convenient, or at times even participate in making this situation worse through algorithms, which we define as filter bubbles. And there's also research that says, no, this is actually you just choosing your friends and whoever
of course. And there's also there's also this idea that obviously this effect is not the same for everyone, right? There's this idea of the knowledge gap, which is even increased by the switch to more information sources, because people who already know a lot, who are already involved with politics a lot, will use these sources to get more informed, while people who are not interested in politics have more ways of avoiding these more serious political information sources. So this widens the gap between people who already know a lot and people who don't know that much about politics.
This almost reminds me of what we talked about earlier, because we're talking about here right now about the chances, the opportunities that we have with social media. So in my personal opinion, this would be the optimistic way of looking at it, right? So the opportunity of social media, what we can achieve and do with social media, is definitely a topic to mention. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, we also talked about biases. We also talked about confirmation bias. We also talked about all these other things, just to challenge the opinion here a little bit. Does that, just because we have the opportunity to also create this world you talked about earlier, Steve, where we have this perfect balance of biases through some sort of a social engineering? I feel like social media would be relatively the easiest way to create the social engineering in some sort, where biases could technically be balancing each other out. So does our access to information, or our opportunity that comes with social media, does this make a difference if people are not participating in it the way we are discussing right now?
Well, okay, this is interesting, because I was thinking about this as Ming was speaking. Here's what I would say about this, because in a sense, one could square the circle. One reason, I think that too much of the discussion, and so like the way you have your question phrased there, too much of the discussion is on the consumption side of information. And so the point that you were just making, Okan, which is correct, namely, people can produce information too, right? And one of the reasons why I think filter bubbles and echo chambers get created and maintained is actually people become very practiced in developing these ideas that they share with others, right? It becomes, that's part of, as it were, the bonding, social bonding ritual is actually to develop very elaborated versions of what people outside the group might call a prejudice, right? So if they're going to be climate denialists, they're going to be really good climate denialists. They will have read everything. They will have answers, in their back pocket for all of the people who want to say there's climate change going on. So in that respect, right, these people who hold all these views that we find so abhorrent, right, are probably the most skillful presenters and arguers for those views. And in a sense, that is one of the consequences of the filter bubble echo chamber environment, is people have opportunities, as it were, to become very practiced, very articulated, very elaborate in their defenses of these views, which is one of the reasons why I think the so-called right-minded people, the truth people, right, the people who really know the truth, are often blindsided by them, because they think that their opponents are a lot dumber than they really are, right? They're not so dumb. They actually do know a lot of this stuff. And because they have this disconfirmation bias thing going on, right, they read the opponents very carefully, right? And they try to come up with arguments, and they've got them there ready to go. This is one of the things that, in fact, the social media world has allowed, right? And this is one of the reasons why you end up getting this kind of entrenchment of sides, is that people aren't so easily persuaded by the experts anymore, right? They want actually more presented to them, right? Because they're able to come up with responses. And this is what you see all the time. And that's what makes the job really hard from the standpoint of people who still want to maintain some uniform standard of truth.
And so when we talked about the uniform, we also talked about the expert bias. So now it might be seeming like, is there a universal kind of, is there uniform truth and and did we get better with the topic that we talked about with expert bias? Did we get better since then in creating these truths, in your opinion? Or do you think that that argument is still just as valid when it comes to creating this epistemic authority?
I mean, I think my view about this is, I think that first of all, there's no reason to think that this kind of expert bias stuff has disappeared at all. Okay, that's the first point. The second point is, I think the experts have the additional disadvantage of not quite realizing what they're up against now, right? And so you see very often among the expert community this kind of response that when you deal with climate change denialists, when you deal with creationists, when you deal with people who believe in alternative medicine, don't argue with them, right? There's a lot of that. Don't give them time, right? Because that's to treat them with a kind of respect they don't deserve, right? This is a very common response that you get from the expert community. It's totally bonkers why they do this, because what they don't want to do is they don't want to establish a kind of new common ground where argumentation occurs. The experts want other people who are going to challenge them to start from their side of the argument already, right? I mean, that's the problem, right? That what we need to do is to establish a new sense of level playing field, right? So that experts and non-experts can actually debate each other over what are genuinely contested issues. Because most of these issues, right, when we talk about, is creationism a real view? Is anti-vaccination a real view? Well, if you look at the experts, no, it's not. But if you look at the rest of the population, it certainly is, right? And it seems to me you've got to start from that, right? And then you have to say, what does a level playing field look like so that you can actually have arguments across the divide? So you need a new normal, right? You need a new normal. And the problem is that the expert community has yet to really get that through their head.
Do you think, I think the main response to what you just said would be, a very common response I hear to this is, well, is there a point to talk to them? Because if the people that you're having a conversation with, having this discussion with, their starting point, if their starting point is not factual in any way, okay, if we want to assume,
That's false. That's false.
I'm very aware that I'm talking to somebody trained in philosophy, so I won't get into too much about this fact, truth, all this stuff. But let's assume that there's a objective truth. If I think the common narrative here would be, if they do not, if they're talking about their realities, is this a valid argument? And the second narrative I think that comes to my mind, at least, is what kind of can we? I think that maybe the point shouldn't be maybe to convince them. Maybe that shouldn't be the goal of your conversation in the first place. However, the point of having this conversation a lot of times is, okay, you don't believe in climate change. I believe in climate change. Science is on my side. If there's any level of objective truth, I personally go with science. So there's my view. What is your view? And it's not embedded in how I create my truth. So therefore, and alongside with all these biases that we talked about, this in-group bias and cognitive dissonance and all sorts of things, it just looks like, to me at least, that that's just the hard job. And it just seems like, yeah, it's...
Well, look, okay, first of all, I think there's one issue is whether democracy matters in any of this, okay? Because I do think, unless I'm mistaken, we don't live in Plato's Republic. And in fact, the experts seem to be losing all the elections, right? I mean, right? Reason why we've got this post-truth thing in the first place, right? This thing wouldn't have even been in a dictionary if it weren't for the fact that the expert community lost 2 very significant elections, okay? So there is, as it were, that fact, right? There's that social fact that experts have to come to terms with and can't be in denial about, okay? I think that's a first point. Now, of course, you might say, well, you start by saying, why should we take all these other people seriously? Well, they're most of the population. That's the answer, right? That's the first day. They're most of the population. They're not going away. And unless you decide to, somehow bring about Plato's Republic through China, maybe, right, where you get some kind of totalitarian version going on, that's not what we have. What we live with now is not going to disappear, right? So in a sense, the burden is kind of on the experts to reorient themselves. And here I would say something about the people that the experts are arguing against. And this is where I think they are much more sophisticated than they're given credit for. So for example, we have this business of facts. I think what we see now in the post-truth condition is not some kind of avoidance or negligence of facts. Rather, it's facts being turned into political footballs, right? So in other words, people are using the same data, the same facts, and they're spinning them differently, right? And statistics, of course, is the great, ground of this. And by the way, I think we see a lot of this in the coronavirus crisis, right? Where everyone's spinning statistics to their own advantage, experts and non-experts, right? And the problem is not facts in the sense that facts are out there, more facts out there than ever before, but nobody, as it were, has a monopoly on the interpretation or the framing of the facts. And so you end up getting radically different interpretations of the same facts. I mean, if you remember about 10 years ago now, there was this thing in Britain called ClimateGate, right? At the University of East Anglia, which was running one of the big research networks involved in climate change. And all these guys, of course, are very much for man-made climate change and all that jazz. But what happened was that a journalist in the UK got access to their emails, where they were basically passing data back and forth and trying to come up with some articles that they could publish in Science and Nature and so forth. And one of the things that was really clear from the email correspondence was that these guys are kind of setting up their models, setting up their diagrams in a way to preclude, right, the climate change denialists any traction, right? So in other words, they realize they are, in fact, in a kind of contest. And it's not that the facts speak neutrally by themselves, but they have got to be presented in the right way so they don't become hostage to fortune, right? And you see this, and people are becoming more and more aware of this, right? That just having the facts is not sufficient, as it were, in terms of interpretations and so forth, that there's a lot more involved. And the question then becomes, should the so-called experts have a monopoly on the power to actually frame and interpret the facts? Now, you see, you have to start from that point in the argument, and then the experts have to make their argument why they're better. This is the point. At this point, then the experts need to make the argument that they're better. That's where I think we are in history.
So the scientific scientific research, scientific community, scientific research, do you believe that they still need to kind of almost buy their validity in these topics?
They have to reestablish it. They have to, as it were, they have to kind of make the argument anew. They cannot assume they've inherited it somehow from the history of science or the history of politics or whatever. I mean, here Donald Trump is very interesting in this regard, because Hillary Clinton, when she was running for president, the thing that she was constantly pushing was that, she is kind of, as it were, the standard bearer of this great progressive movement that we've been having in the United States, since the end of the Second World War or whatever, right? And that she is the natural successor to that. And Donald Trump comes along and said, "What progress? What you guys have, what you guys have been running is completely crooked." Right? So he took the same facts, he respun them, okay, and he won, right? But it is true that Hillary Clinton, and this is also true of the people defending the European Union in the UK, right? These people presumed they had an entitlement that somehow they were the rational people, and so you should vote for them. And that just speaks for itself. You don't actually have to make real arguments. And I think that this is something that, the Brexit thing and the Trump thing have in common, is the fact that they really took head on the fact that the experts were just presuming authority.
On that token, let's talk about a little bit about what can we do. Let's talk about.
So we're on the side of the experts for the sake of the argument. Whose side are we on in this?
I don't know. I don't know anything at this point.
No, but that's an important point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely. I don't feel that I have enough knowledge to have an opinion on this topic. That's why we have you here. But have you two here. But it's an interesting perspective to kind of posit that scientific community should kind of revalidate or rebrand or revalidate their authority on social environmental.
Exactly.
I think I'm more personally leaning towards the rebranding than revalidating. For me, I think it's valid, or at least the most valid we have. Rebranding for me more.
I think you're
feels
going to find that there's not such a clear distinction when you get down to doing it.
Okay, and the rebranding for me is more about maybe communicating it or arguing it in a different way, which is closer, I think, to what you've talked about earlier as well.
Yeah, but see, but this is where you have to get in the trenches with the arguments of your opponents. And once you do that, you're going to find that you're going to have to actually get into a lot more detail, a lot more into what you might call validation country than you may have imagined.
Yeah, we actually talk about this in our organization as well a lot. And when we talk about, I mean, we don't have a huge following or anything like that, but still when we talk about in the past years, like posting statistics or stuff like this about the issues that we are talking about, and, to think about how we can communicate these issues in a way that is not just like, okay, you guys are less intellectual and you don't know and we know and these are the facts and here are some numbers and please do what I'm telling you to do, but just more communicate in a different way.
I think
when it comes to most social environmental challenges. Go ahead, Ming.
I think that scientists are in general very bad at communicating their research, and science communication is a relatively new field. It's coming up now more and more, where we study the science of communicating science, right? One of the problems here is that it's still at this point usually run at the exact sciences departments, where they actually don't know that much about social issues, cognitive biases, and the whole psychology of communicating your findings. But what I think is very weird, actually, is that we as scientists are used to thinking about alternative explanations for our own findings, for our own numbers, for our own research. And we're used to talking to other scientists about this. But why can't we do this with the general public. And I think a part of the problem here is also with journalists, because journalists want a clear story, and that's usually just not there.
This is also something that is quite important that we talk about a lot also in the team, and one of the reasons why we have this conference. I don't want to seem like I'm plugging it now, but just bring all these people in the same room. Like everybody, all of these people, bring them in the same room and facilitate a conversation. And this is, I think, in the change-making impact world, what we feel is missing a lot. Even when we do these interviews with these experts, we find out that even if you're from the exact same university, you're in silos, and you guys, like, you can be talking to each other and like have a lot of synergies, but it's just in real life not happening. And a lot of this knowledge stays in silos, and this, what we talked about here, whether within experts or outside of experts with the general public, just doesn't happen enough. Okay, I want to talk about, before we run out of time, what we can do. Let's talk about our individual lives. Let's talk about how can we learn more about our biases, or is that even the goal here? How can we check that we're addressing them in the right way? What can we do to kind of create an open, safe space for us and others to tackle these things that we talked about today? Maybe Ming, you can start.
Yeah, what you can do about your own biases is tough, because humans are biased. This happens before you even become consciously aware of it. What you can do after you get consciously aware is you can challenge these biases, right? We all know that we are more critical of our opponents than of ourselves. Can we try to play devil's advocate and be just as critical towards ourselves? What I think that we can also do is educate ourselves and others about the processes that, for instance, scientists and also journalists use to establish some idea of what is more true than something else, right? Journalists have norms where they talk to multiple sources of different sides of the aisle, these types of things, where you think, okay, this is a way to get closer to the truth, at least. And that's a huge difference with a blog, for instance, where these norms don't apply. And if more people would be aware, maybe this would restore some sort of sense of what is true and what is not.
I understand. Steve, what other actionable advice can you give people listening in the audience today that they can maybe implement in their life after this talk? Are there any tips we can use or mindsets that we should have, perhaps?
Well, I think one thing that is quite easy to find out about in the online world is negative things people are saying about you, and that actually can often be very useful. If you can bear it, because it's very easy to find. I certainly find it pretty easily. And it does give you a sense of how you're being received, right? It does give you a sense of how you're being received, and you may find it fine, right? And you can say, well, because of where they're coming from, I understand why they see what I'm saying this way. But there might be some things where, in a sense, wow, they shouldn't be thinking this about me, there's something wrong, you see, and that can then serve as a kind of corrective. The other thing I would say is that the motivational bias stuff is really interesting, because I think we sometimes think of it too much in the negative way. But when people are very motivated to look at something from a certain perspective, they often, they illuminate something that otherwise would be ignored, right? And I think there you want to do the comparison, right? That, if let's say you're in this kind of very heated debate about climate change and so forth, right? And it's very polarized, and you're very clear about what your view is, have a look at what the other side tends to stress, as evidence, as argument, because usually what you'll find is that they are stressing something that you probably don't take quite so seriously. And it'll be interesting to think, and then look at what is it that they're ignoring or downplaying in what you're saying. And you see, that I think is quite useful in a way to get a sense, because that especially will give you some illumination, I think, perhaps in terms of value differences, what matters in the argument, because I think that's very often why these polarizations don't disappear very easily, is it's not really so much an issue of fact, but rather the significance of the fact, you might say. And that will then shift the relative weighting that's given to various facts. So you don't have to be denying stuff straight out, right? You can just say yes, but it's not so important. And I think that is the biggest thing to deal with, to be honest with you, in these debates, because they're much more sophisticated than people realize. And it's not just a straightforward denying of facts. It's rather saying, yes, but it's not so important. This other fact is more important. You see, and I think it's pretty easy to get that kind of perspective now.
On one level, the conditions under which this is defined. On the other level, also what you said about even if that was something that we commonly agreed on, the communicating this is also important, but also addressing or realizing what the other camp is thinking, what their kind of perspective is.
Exactly.
I would like to ask you one last question before we move on to the Q&A. And let's start with you, Steve. If you had all the resources in the world right now at your disposal, not in a magical world, in our world, what kind of project or initiative do you think you would set up, or what action do you think you would take to most effectively address these issues we talked about today?
Well, it's tough, obviously. I actually, my view about this, I guess the thing that I find most interesting and challenging is two things, two general kinds of projects. One is something kind of inspired on the Popper line of trying to get the biases to kind of work against each other in some constructive fashion. So in other words, don't try to get rid of the biases, but somehow have them interact with each other in a way that you end up getting some kind of productive consequence, right? So a kind of a social engineering of the spontaneous space of social media, you might say, sort of thing Chinese people might do. I think that would be very interesting. And another one, I guess, well, I think that one of the things that we're going to need to do is to somehow come up with some kind of idea of a level playing field for argument. You know, how do you establish norms in a situation where you're starting from rather radically contested positions? Now, people might say, oh, well, that's impossible, right? But actually, I don't think it's so impossible, because in fact, these radically contested positions, like the ones we've been talking about, usually are actually dealing with some common set of facts, some common set of issues, right? Which in a sense, at a very elementary level, they actually agree on, but then they go on to frame them in radically different ways that makes communication impossible. You see? Now, if one could kind of get a standard, as it were, establishing a standard by which you could, this is the idea. In a way, what I'm talking about here is a bit like what Francis Bacon was imagining with the idea of the crucial experiment, right? Francis Bacon, one of the founders of the scientific method, right? He came up with this idea because he was really concerned that there are all these metaphysical views out there in early modern science, people claiming all sorts of things. And the question is, how do you tell whether one's right or wrong? Well, what you do is you try to come up with something where only one of the sides could be right and the other one would have to be wrong, right? So you come up with a crucial experiment in some sense. And that requires that both sides agree, at least for purposes of the experiment, on a level playing field, right? And you see, now what this would involve, I think, in the kind of world we live in now, is that we actually think about inquiry and how we determine whether things are true and false in a much more gamesman-like fashion, right? It becomes a bit like a game, right? Where in a sense, you're setting up this kind of experiment. One side might win, but that doesn't mean the other side's completely vanquished forever. It can come back and play again, like in a game, like a football game or something like this, right? And in a sense, if we started thinking about inquiry more along those lines, right, that then it'll be a lot easier for communication to take place within an admittedly contested space where the big disagreements between people aren't going to disappear.
Okay, that's a lot to decipher. We have. This is a good place to mention. We are taking notes as well, which will be also made available after the talk as well, because we have not a huge amount of time to tackle such a huge topic here. So you can also always refer back to that as well. Ming, I also want to ask you the same question. What kind of project, or I mean, you are a researcher already, so what kind of action, if you had all the resources in the world, what kind of action would you take to kind of try to most effectively address what we talked about today?
Well, I think it's interesting what Steve just said, that we need this kind of game-like field where we have different ideas that can combat each other, and if you agree on the way that you test it, then you can resolve small steps in this test. But I also think that we also have this kind of game, sort of, right? It's science. The only thing is that the biggest part of the population, one, doesn't have access to the science, and two, don't know how this works. So I think a part of this is that we need to see science education and journalistic education as a more important part of citizenship, right? I think if more people would know how science works, that would also make it more interesting for journalists to report on the process of science instead of just one simple fact that came out of it, which is never true, right? So I think that what we need to do is see if we can actually establish something like that, if it actually makes sense to include science and journalistic education into high school programs during adolescence, when we know that these types of attitudes are formed, and see if they can actually have effect on the long term. But those are obviously very difficult and expensive projects.
That's a great point. We in Primeware believe in the power of social entrepreneurs as well. So if there are any social entrepreneurs listening, there's an idea for you, extending the teaching kids about how science works and how these things are constructed in the first place. Okay, let's go and check out the questions that came. There were a few of them that came through our talk. The first one that I would like to ask you is, I think we've, to a certain extent, answered this one a little bit, but if you want to say more about it, Philip says, from an evolutionary perspective, what are the advantages of biases in general? Since it's such a fundamental part of human perception, it has to be quite useful to have biases, at least in certain situations.
I think that certain biases definitely have a very clear evolutionary background. If you look at the negativity bias that I looked at, if you look at prehistoric times, you know, it's obviously much more important to pay close attention to a bear that's nearby than to a piece of fruit that's nearby. Because if you don't see the bear, you die. If you don't see the fruit, you're hungry. Right? So this negativity bias has a very clear background in evolution, and but the thing is that the world changed and our instincts didn't. Same with these motivational biases. Obviously, you need to be part of groups. So therefore, it is important for you to be able to protect these groups and keep them in a positive view in your mind. The thing is that if you want to have a clear view of what the world looks like, it's not that handy.
Can I add something?
Sure, of course.
I think the general answer, as it were, is that biases cut down the information space that you have to search before you do something, right? And so I think that is the kind of the bottom line aspect of it. It's a cognitive efficiency measure, right? A bias, right? And that works a lot, right? And not always in a detrimental way. And so I think, in a sense, this is why the whole issue about eliminating bias isn't really the right way to think about this matter. It's rather how to turn the biases to the appropriate advantage, right? Yeah. That's more what the issue is about. How
to navigate it, how to use it to our advantage.
Yeah, it's not about eliminating it.
Yeah. We have another question from Jedan. Aren't other people's biases mirrors of ours, and we somehow don't recognize them as ours? So she says, to me, that sounds like a fragmentation within ourselves. Follows with an example. I, for example, learned about my biases by judging others and then finding out that they were mine too. Could it be that the core problem is the fact that we unconsciously choose to not identify with our negative parts because we want to be liked and accepted by others?
Huh.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether the idea that we want to be liked and accepted by others is the reason why, but this third person effect is very, very well documented. You always think that bad things are done by other people, but not by you. Also, we also think that advertisements don't work on us, but they do work on other people. I think there was this finding that about 80% of working people think that they're at the top 20% of the best performing people in their job, right? This is obviously not possible. But we always have these third person effects where we think that most positive things apply to us and negative things apply to others. That's another bias. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, that is among the oldest in social psychology, that this kind of asymmetry of how we judge ourselves and judge others for a whole lot of different dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Julia. She says, going back to Plato's rejection of playwrights and poets, is it not necessary to have such topics being dealt with as they're part of human nature and experience rather than overlooking them?
Oh, that's a good question, but I think in a way it's a bit of a modern way of putting it. You have to realize, we use this distinction between fact and fiction and literature and science and all these things. We act as if this distinction is self-evident, but in fact, this is one of the things that actually gets really only institutionalized in the modern era, largely through education and universities and things like that. So in Plato's day, there isn't like fact versus fiction. That distinction doesn't exist. What Plato sees in the playwrights are people competing for authority, right? He sees them competing for authority at this very dramatic level that looks kind of political, right? Because if you think about it, politics in Athens is about people making speeches, rhetoric, very dramatic, getting people to go to war, all this kind of stuff. That's what, Athenian democracy was about. And then you get these playwrights added to the mix, and they're doing kind of the same thing on stage, right? So so the issue here is basically trying to put a lid on what is possible in the real world. That is really what the point was. In a sense, it's more about limiting the imagination, because the imagination will run wild and it'll lead to social instability. I think that's the context in which you should see Plato's interest in censorship, right? It's about containing the possibilities of the imagination. Okay, so he doesn't see an intrinsically clear distinction between fact and fiction. He doesn't see it. And this is why it becomes a political decision, right? We're the ones in the modern era who hold this kind of radical fact-fiction distinction.
Very interesting.
And that's why we find it hard to talk about fact and truth in political terms, because we somehow imagine that facts and truth are somehow out there. I don't know where, but out there, outside of politics. Whereas Plato doesn't have that problem, actually, right? Plato's in the process of constructing the truth regime, as Michel Foucault would call it, right? That's what Plato's business is.
We have another question here. As a scientific analogy, we accept what is currently considered the dominant system of facts and rules, a paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn believes, and we're also moving within that paradigm. If we outsource this to the social realm, one might think that there's a rift here of several quote-unquote speaking communities whose worldviews are completely incompatible. Is it fundamentally the case that these fixed worldviews make it impossible to distinguish between others, and one is therefore condemned? And then there's I think a continuation of that question, perhaps. So Is it fundamentally the case that these fixed worldviews make it impossible to distinguish between others?
Well, can I address this? Because I've written a lot about Kuhn, and I think in a way, Kuhn is starting from Plato's standpoint as well. Because the reason for Kuhn, if you ask Kuhn, what was so wonderful about the scientific revolution, which is kind of where his story starts, right, of how you get science, it's because all of these, irresolvable metaphysical differences that have existed through history suddenly get tied down to some kind of common method of evaluation, which is this scientific method stuff we were talking about earlier with regard to Bacon and so forth, where you actually get a kind of common level playing field where regardless of what your other beliefs are, this is the way we're going to judge things. And if you can't play by these rules, you're not in science, right? So you're excluded. And that's why for Kuhn, a science only has one paradigm. If you have multiple paradigms, you're no longer doing science, and you end up in this kind of incommensurable worldview business, which is what Kuhn thinks happens most of the time, right? Science is like a little oasis of truth regime, right? And uniformity of judgment that doesn't exist anywhere else in society, right? So Kuhn has something like Plato's view in his mind, okay? And so the challenge always for anyone who wants to invent science or revalidate science or rebrand science is to establish the common level playing field, right? Where people from the outside agree to the terms by which their knowledge claims will be judged, right? That is the challenge I think science always has when it's outwardly facing to the public, right? And that's why it's been very important historically in science that the scientific method be at some fundamental level transparent, right? Observation, right? The reason why replication is so important in science is that it doesn't just depend on the first guy to see something. The second guy can see the same thing. The third guy can see the same thing, right? And that's how you know it's real, right? That kind of transparency of method, the measurement stuff, the counting stuff, it doesn't just depend on who's the measurer and who's the counter. Anyone could do the same routine and come up with the same result. You see, that level of transparency has always been very much part of what has validated the scientific method outside of the expert community, outside of those who are directly involved in the production of knowledge. And I think one of the problems that science has faced, I would say, in the 20th century, certainly the second half of the 20th century, is that as science becomes more technical, right, in a sense that it's not just about seeing something and measuring something, but it also involves that you have to know a lot of theory, you have to know a lot of concepts. The world turns out to be incredibly counterintuitive in all kinds of ways that you need university education for, right? I mean, all of that stuff, which is really largely second half of the 20th century, that kind of makes it harder, right, for science's transparency as a kind of level playing field of knowledge to be rhetorically, communicated, right? And I think that's a real challenge that science has, right? It's become so over technical, right, that it's always tempting to say, if you don't understand what I'm saying, get a PhD first and then talk to me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We have a couple more questions before we close today. One is, this is more about fake news how can we teach other people and learn for ourselves to be critical, but also not to fall for fake news? Because I think the difference between critical thinking and falling for fake news is not always clear, but it makes a huge difference. So which methods would you use to teach, let's say, you have a classroom full of kids and this fake news business is just becoming a bigger and bigger problem. What would you tell them?
Right. I think that to answer this, you first have to establish what is fake news, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, there's a lot of false information online. There is misinformation, information that is meant to be true, but was, by poor journalism or by being misled, turned out false. There's disinformation, information that is specifically meant to be false and to deceive people. And then there's fake news, which is basically disinformation packaged as if it was constructed through journalistic norms. Right? So when you come across information online, I think what you should do always if you don't trust the source, is check it. A Google search usually reveals a lot. And the biggest problem is that we check stuff that we don't agree with, and we don't check stuff that we do agree with, right? So this is well documented. So what you can do yourself is, check your sources.
Can I add to that?
Sure, of course.
I don't disagree with that. I do think, though, that one of the things, this is where I think having so much access to different kinds of news sources is very useful, because it's typically, the same stories will be covered by different news sources in quite different ways. And just looking at how they do it, right, gives you a really good clue as to the biases, right? And so we don't have to talk about fake news. We could talk about various biases one way or another. What kinds of things tend to be emphasized when a story is reported? Who are the outliers in terms of the reporting of a story in a certain kind of way versus others? And there will be different news sources and different to answer that question in different news stories, right? And the thing is, as long as you just don't look at just one, but you look at a variety of news sources covering the same story, you get used to the bias, as it were, right? And then you know how to control for it whenever you read something by that news source. That's what I would say. I mean, in fact, if you look at Andrew Breitbart, the founder of Breitbart News, right, the great alt-right news feed, which is the kind of, the great, architect of all this fake news stuff, you might say, he's very clear about what he was doing. He basically saw New York Times was covering stories in a certain kind of way all the time, from what he could see, because he has a completely different worldview from the New York Times. And so he said, okay, I'm going to take all the same stories and I'm just going to spin them my way. And that's what Breitbart News is, basically, right? And that's why all these different news sources, they're usually getting their initial stories from the same news agencies, and then what they're doing then is they're repackaging it for their client base. And that's how, in fact, they make their money, is doing that. And so if you just acquaint yourself with a wide range of these news feeds, you'll see the biases, and then you can operate from there however you will.
So diversify your source of information, basically.
Diversify. Yeah.
One last question. It's about values. How can we distinguish biases in other people's views from a difference in values? I think if you have a difference in values, and go ahead.
There is a lot of written about this as well, especially in the social identity literature, where they say, different groups have different values, and they tend to show these values pretty clearly. The media are often seen as a way that more dominant groups get to show their values more often than minorities and other lower status groups. And when these values are under attack, so the values of your group, then you will feel attacked again. So these are, I think, these are types of social identity threats that cause these motivated reasoning biases. And I don't think they're specifically different than from other people's views. Views are more like a result of someone's values often.
I agree. I actually agree with that answer, 100%.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this today, for being here. Ming, where they can find you if they want, where can they find you if they want to keep in touch and read more of your research on this topic?
Well, they can find me on the website of the University of Vienna. Just Google me, you will find me.
Great. Steve, do you want to tell us where they can find you? And also, you do have a new book coming out.
Yes.
Where would we be able to? It's about post-truth, and where would we be able to find that when it gets published, and where they can keep in touch with you overall?
Okay, well, I'm on Twitter, and I'm also I've got a website at the University of Warwick in England, so the new book coming out in the autumn is called A Player's Guide to the Post-Truth Condition, the name of the game. And so a lot of this game stuff that was raised toward the end is kind of relevant to what that book covers. And it's a shorter follow-up to the first book I published in 2018, Post-Truth, Knowledge is a Power Game, which is where a lot of the stuff that you were bringing up with me about Plato is discussed. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And you could contact me at my university email. If you go to my website, you can find that pretty easily. I'm not an obscure person to find.
Great. You're both so easy to find and very approachable, very accessible. Thank you so much for being here. I would like to just close by giving some more information about some of the next steps that people might want to take. I want to mention that the One Data Conference will take place in March 2021. You can check our website for that for details. It will cover solid waste, waste and food waste, gender equality, and responsible digitalization from the lens of systems thinking, social innovation, and social entrepreneurship. If you do not know what those words mean, that's also great. You should come and have a look. And the other thing I want to do is also, I would like for you guys to, while I'm doing this, let us know what are you, from what we talked about today, what are you looking forward to learning about the most from the concepts that we talked about. We talked about a lot of different concepts. They're not all on here, but we talked about entity-protective cognition. We talked about fake news. We talked about the philosophy behind post-truth. We talked about the intersection between social media and post-truth, and we talked about what we can do in our personal lives to be more aware of these biases, although it's not really possible to get rid of them fully. So while I'm telling this, please go to this this poll and let us know how you what you're looking forward to learning more about. Meanwhile, I will let you know that you can keep in touch with us through Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Our handle is primemovers.org. There will be 2 other meetups before March. On the topic of one concerning gender equality and one concerning waste. These will be, of course, hopefully offline at this time, where we can also re-meet with our community as well. We also have one day, the community, we have a Facebook group for this where we also meet up and just do also informal get-togethers as well. This you can find out on Facebook under One Day, the community. Now, we have a lot of, we have some answers here. There we go, they're coming in. Okay, interesting. Okay. One thing I do want to mention, now that we're on the topic of this, is we've also done on our website, we created some sort of resource library. We get this question a lot when we do meetups, like what is systems thinking? Where do I kind of start? What is post-truth? What does it mean? Where do I kind of start? So we built a resource library. You can go on library.oneday.at where you can, I'll share the poll results in a second back again. I want to show you quickly. We can also have a look at this website. We have topics on gender equality, waste, digitalization, systems thinking, social innovation, social entrepreneurship. And under digitalization, there are, okay, normally there are resources there that you can have a look at, where you can filter according to their length and their type and their source and everything else. And it's a great place to start if you would like to learn more about some of the topics that we have addressed today. Is there anything else you'd like to mention, Steve and Ming?
No, thank you very much for having me.
Yes,
thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. I'm sure we will keep in touch for our work going forward. Thank you so much for being here. And you can always keep in touch through primemovers.org or our website, oneday.at, or direct messages on social media. With that, I wish you a really nice evening and see you in the next meetup.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.